It says that I'm live. Hey everybody, Jem Schofield of the C47, and welcome to another episode of Gearbox 2.0. It's a live stream. We're talking about the C500 Mark II and the PXW-FX9, two brand new, not yet released camera systems from Canon and Sony, and definitely a lot of chatter, a lot of conversation about these two cameras that were announced just prior to or at IBC 2019. And welcome to the chat. And if you're here, then I hope to hear your voice. I am going to talk for the next 45 minutes and hopefully have some feedback over here in the chat. So say hello. Please let me know, first and foremost, if you can see and hear me fine. So if anybody is here, is anybody here? It says there's some people here. There we go. Shazam, the iPad producer. How's it going? Shout out to you. Please, as Shazam has done, use the @the_C47 when you are asking questions or making comments that you want my attention to be drawn to, as opposed to having a conversation in the chat with each other. What's up, Matthew Reynolds? Welcome to this live stream. Sounds and looks great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have sound, we have picture, so that means that we can continue on with the live stream. Still getting my feet wet, though I've gone into the swimming pool or the ocean a little bit more with Lightstream. When everything's working with this solution, it's working really well. And one of the things that I'm excited about is, and maybe we'll talk about a little bit more on Camera and Flask later on when Caleb and I do our part 2 of IBC 2019. Cindy in the 6th, thank you for the heads up on everything too, is the Blackmagic Design ATEM Mini, which I have in fact pre-ordered already. I'm hoping to be in the initial shipments because with this space, with content for my channel, one of the things that I'm trying to do is get into more multi-camera. And that doesn't mean seeing more than one camera at the same time, but it does mean switching so that I can create better educational content for you. So whether it's in a live stream scenario or it's creating my own content that's going to get recorded, I am looking for, have been looking for a cost-effective solution. And I think the ATEM Mini, while it should have some quirks, I'm expecting that at its price point of less than $300 US, I think it will be an excellent solution for what I am trying to do. And it will bring in some of my older cameras again, like my two C100 Mark Is, which can be used for that stuff. Good morning, Travis. Good morning, Andres. Here we are. Okay, so let's start talking about these cameras because they are relatively big announcements. I'm going to probably echo some of the things that some of my friends have said, especially over at newsshooter.com, and please hit that website if you want more in-depth information that gets into even more about the tech specs. And I also invite you to check out their IBC wrap video where, surprisingly, one of the original co-founders of News Shooter, Dan Chung, who I know very well, is part of the conversation along with Matt Allard and Eric Naso, also friends of mine. Okay, good. So here we go. Let's just start bringing up some specs and start talking about things. Again, I always ask people to be involved in the chat. It's important. It keeps the conversation going. And what's the point of doing a live stream unless you're going to have the chat? Because otherwise, yeah, you get it. So, you know, at the C47, for questions that you have, you can also ask general production questions. I have, number one, have not used either of these two cameras yet, and I'm hoping to, what's up, Josh? And I'm hoping to create educational content on the cameras as well. So there's some talk about doing something like that in the relatively near future. Hey, Kevin. Also, I want to say that from a user standpoint, I have a lot of experience using the FS series, both FS7 and FS7 Mark II. And I also have a lot of experience using Canon Cinema EOS cameras. Really no experience using the C700, but ridiculous amount of experience using the C100, C100 Mark II, C300, C300 Mark II, the C200, a little bit C500, but really not much. But the reality is that what is happening in the Canon camera, while there's some big changes with the C500 Mark II, these are cameras that I really know very well, as much as inside out as you could probably say. I would say that in Cine EI mode, IE, I'm losing my mind here. Yeah, Cine EI mode on the FS7 series, I know that about as well as you could. And then I don't use custom mode that much on that camera system, though I have in the past, especially when I want to ride ISO and things like that. Morning, Tommy, David, nice to have everybody over here. So let's get into some specs here. Pulled from B&H. So I'm coming back, everybody. The reason that the sound is gone is because when you C46, C45, C44, we're counting down the C's. The reason that the audio is gone is because in Lightstream, every single time you create a new scene, you have to add audio to it if you want there to be audio. And that's my bad. And now, so I'm sitting right now on my original scene, which has audio. I'm going to switch over to the first slide for the FX9, and we can actually take a look at that. Thank you for hanging out during that radio silence, and hopefully you'll be able to hear me now. There's always a little bit of a delay when you're using Lightstream, when it's sending everything over to YouTube. So please give me a heads up that you can hear me now and that everything is good to go. And what I'll do is, as I go through these pages, I'll make sure that as I click to the page, the first thing I do is add audio to that scene. And then that way you'll be able to hear me and we shouldn't have this problem anymore. So does everybody hear me? Let's get down to business here. I need a little chat feedback. So first of all, let's just, and I'll stay on here until I have confirmation that we have audio again before I go to the next slide. But the deal is that with the FX9, sound is good. Okay, Travis, let me switch over. Give me 1 second, everybody. I'm just going to click through each one of the scenes and add audio to it so we don't have this, this delay anymore. So that one has audio. You should be able to hear that. Now you're going to go silent for just a minute, maybe less. It'll be less than a minute. And I'll go through and I'll just keep adding audio to each of the other screens. So hold on. Okay, kids. Morning ruined. Yeah, soothing voice, my ass. Elevator music. Exactly. It's so painful when people are waiting for you to do something, and I'm sure some people have left because they're like, I can't deal with this. Let's see. Okay, so now we're back. So let's talk about this. Everybody just let me know that everything's fine, that when you're seeing this first slide, which says 6K CMOS Exmor R sensor, that you can basically see that, and then we'll start to talk about all of this stuff. And thank you for hanging in there. Jeopardy theme. Oh, I don't know where. I don't know if we should be talking about Jeopardy right now with Alex and everything that's going on. Okay, good. So here we go. Voice is loud and clear. Here we are. So first of all, FX9, 6K sensor, not a 6K camera system unless they decide to do something in the future in terms of outputting a 6K image. So that's number one. It's really a 4K camera, and in fact, shipping, from date of shipping, it'll be UHD 4K, and then they'll add the 4096 by 2160 after that. It's a new sensor, from what I can tell, and the reason I think it's a new sensor is because the dual ISO, the 8000 and the 4000 ISO, are different than what you have in the Venice camera system, which is the big sibling of the FX9. And the sensor is I believe, backlit, and apparently supposed to reduce noise reduction, blah, 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 blah. 15 stops of dynamic range. David's saying it seems like that's what we're getting with the new cameras. I mean, there's some arguing that maybe on certain RED cameras you're getting a little bit more if you're doing their version of HDR, but the reality is we're sort of sitting in about that 14 to 16 stops of dynamic range. And then there's always the discussion about how usable that dynamic range is, and that is probably best described by a camera like the C500 Mark II, which when you're shooting in Canon Log 2 with that camera, you are in fact getting 15 stops of dynamic range, but the 2 stops down at the bottom that are closest to basically black, if properly exposed, are not necessarily the cleanest stops, and if you're seeing those and you're keeping those stops in post-production, it can get pretty messy. It's really, in my opinion, why Canon Log 3 was created, and what it essentially does is it, in camera while capturing, hides those 2 stops of dynamic range. Kevin says, in terms of the dual ISO, taking Panasonic's route like the EVA 1, yes and no. I think there's a lot of information out there. Whether or not their engineering approach is the same, the concept is the same, that when you have dual ISO, when you go to that higher ISO, it's a native ISO to the camera as well as the lower one. So you should have as clean of an image as a starting point as you would with the lower ISO. But my understanding is that Panasonic's approach to doing that and another company's approach to doing that are slightly different. So 15 stops of dynamic range. Now, I do want to talk about that as sort of a general concept when it comes to camera systems. When we talk about 15 stops of dynamic range, that means that when you are using that camera, in a raw mode, which will, with this camera, the FX9, require the extension unit that they've created for this, or you're using, let's say, a log mode, because this has to do with luminance values, blacks to whites that are captured, that 15 stops is really the maximum capability of that sensor in terms of dynamic range. When you use different gamma settings within a camera system, so for instance, this S-Cinetone, which is supposed to be the default look in the FX9, we don't know how many stops of dynamic range you are actually capturing when you're using that mode, because there's not enough data out there at the moment related to what the gamma curve is. So S-Cinetone is a gamut. It has to do with color. And is that color being captured within a triangle of Rec. 709, P3, 2020, nobody knows at the moment. Hopefully when the manual comes out and we can actually start to take a look at what settings we can choose within the camera, it will start to answer some of those questions. Victor, nice to have you. Victor, come on. Your content from IBC, ridiculous. You were clearly and very easily, I'm not even speaking English right now, you're clearly one of the funniest guys to create content at the show. And I've watched many of your videos, especially the ones at the Aputure booth with Ted. So I appreciate you, and I like the content that you create. So that's a little bit of a little hello, and go check out Victor's stuff. So then we have ISO control. We've talked about the dual ISO, and let's switch over here. Hopefully the audio is going to stay. And there we go. I see audio. Electronic ND filter. Now, I see some things online which talk about, Victor still has 20 videos left. I see some stuff online saying that this is a world's first, that there's a dedicated dial to the very ND on the FX9. There has been a dial on the FS7 Mark II for the very ND as well. So I'm not quite sure what they're trying to say about that, but we'll see. Recording formats. So this is where things get interesting. Camera system is using the same type of cards that it used in the previous FS7 series, which I think is good. Those are the XQD cards. So from a cost standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. Can't tell whether or not it's a new battery system. I think it might be. So that's an issue. And there you go. Adjustable frame rates up to 1 to 60. Looks like we're going to get 60 in 4K. Looks like we're going to get some additional frame rates when we're dropping our resolution, and then possibly in the future with firmware updates. And then we have, boys and girls, the Cinetone look. Now this is interesting because they're doing a little bit of let's take some stuff from the Alpha series and let's take some stuff from the Venice, and they're kind of upstream downstreaming it into this camera system. I don't really think, this is funny, this camera to me is kind of like a Canon move. It's not cannibalizing really anything that's in their lineup. It is about $11,000 US in terms of base price. And then depending on where you are and where you're, you're living, the price of this camera can vary dramatically. I've heard that in New Zealand and I believe in Australia, it's going to be very, very high in terms of initial costs. So we'll have to see. But this Cinetone look is really supposed to be Sony's answer to, I guess, a lot of the chatter and real world experience of not really getting those types of skin tones that we're getting if we're shooting on an ARRI Alexa camera, shooting on a Canon Cinema EOS camera. I would argue a Fujifilm, X series camera. There's just something about those manufacturers. I think that there's other manufacturers. I mean, Blackmagic has come a long way in terms of their color science now. And I think that our G2, Ursa Mini Pro 4.6K, the color that I'm seeing is vastly improved. So Sony needs to step up here. I've been very happy with prior FS7 series cameras when I'm shooting in Cine EI, sgamut.3.cine, and just applying the correct LUTs to that. And I think you can get a nice look out of the camera, but I have struggled historically with both Alpha series and the FS series when it comes to getting the same types of skin tones out of the camera. The real question with Cinetone look, it says look, is again, what's the gamma curve on this? How many stops of dynamic range are we getting? And how gradable is it, even though it looks nice from the beginning? So how wide is this gamut? How wide is the gamma? And those are things that I want to find out so I can, form some more opinions. And I'll definitely be able to form some opinions when I actually get my hands on the camera. Relatively high data rate, 10-bit 422. So you should be able to push and pull it quite a bit, but you may not be getting that 15 stops of dynamic range. I would be happy with the Cinetone look if I was getting 13, because that's essentially what you're getting if you're shooting Canon Log 3 on the Cinema EOS camera. And let's see what happens overall. Fast hybrid AF. So this is a big one. This is Sony basically finally with a digital cinema camera saying we are going to put an AF system in here. It just makes this next evolution of camera that's basically the next version of the FS series, but with full frame 4K. It really starts to make that camera that you could say, okay, this would fit very well into even more corporate video production environments. One of the largest, without question, growing segments of production is in-house. And as a result, the FX9 really becomes a contender for that type of stuff. And then even more usable for news, electronic news gathering, electronic field production, and things like that. Does the FX also have sensor stabilization? And is the Sony autofocus just face and eye detector? Does it have the option to touch and keep focus on every other thing in the frame like Canon? So Loom, those are great questions. There is some form of sensor stabilization in this camera system, but it's not like the C500 Mark II. And apparently you are, at least at the moment, required to go through their Catalyst workflow, their software solutions, in order to take advantage of that. And I don't know if it's actually able to take data from that 6K sensor and use some of that data outside of the UHD 4K or DCI 4K frame in order to stabilize, or you are essentially scaling up your UHD 4K or DCI 4K image when you're using that stabilization feature. Very little data right now regarding that. I think it's a great question. And then this is a big one when you're asking about autofocus. There is no touchscreen on the FX9. So unless Sony releases a touchscreen or a company like SmallHD works with Sony to have camera control and touch for that camera, then at the moment you're really in a joystick style change focus scenario, which is nowhere near as effective or usable as a touch focus like you have in the LMV1 original screen that I have on the C200, or the LMV2, which is a slightly larger touch screen, which is going to be included with and shipping with the C500 Mark II. How do I keep all this data in my head? Maybe that's why I don't sleep at night. Victor, we're gonna Victor, you're asking Victor if he's gonna cover the Tilta flappy screen for the Blackmagic 4K and 6K cameras, which looks great, by the way. Now all we just need Blackmagic, though I doubt they will, because it's kind of like mod our camera, but we need them to create a little mirror feature in the software. Hybrid AF, okay, we get it. Yeah, you're hybrid already. Okay, good. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, Loom, there we go. Let's keep going. Next screen, let's hope the sound carries through. This is it. Oh, we're on this one. Dang it. Let's go to number 4. Here we go. So, advanced image stabilization. Yep. So, Catalyst workflow, as I said. Oh, big one. 4-channel audio recording. So, one of the things that I think about this camera that they get right over the C500 Mark II. First of all audio controls left side of camera for an operator. Important, not right side of camera, which is the default for 2 channels on the C500 Mark II. Another upgrade, which I really like, is the fact that we have pots and everything else for dials and all that good stuff for audio control for all 4 channels. So if you add an additional adapter and you add additional audio, or let's say, for instance, to the hot shoe, you add a dual channel Sony UWP receiver. Let's say you're going to do 2 channels of lavalier input or lavalier and boomed with a plug-on transmitter, and then you could use those 2 XLR inputs on the camera body and have wired inputs to there. So really flexible from that standpoint. I think that that's going to be really important. Time code built into the camera system now on the body, huge. So this out of the box could be really a great camera for reality television and those types of situations. And I think you have to kind of look at that camera in that scenario, shooting something like The Amazing Race or what is it, Survivor. These types of shows could be really fantastic for that. Yeah, there's some footage out there for the C500 Mark II. And remember, this is the same exact sensor as the C700 full-frame camera. The real difference is the processor that's in the C500 Mark II, which is a new Digic 7 processor. I don't know what they're doing. Inputs and outputs, we blah, blah, blah. We get it. Okay, let's go to number 5. Recording modes. So when we talk about recording modes, I think that we really have to talk about the fact that this is where Sony's not cannibalizing their market, right? So we are thinking about this camera very, very much, though full frame now, like an FS7 or FS7 Mark II. So similar recording modes, just now getting full frame. And that's the way you have to think about this camera, as an internally recording camera system. And then you have the extension unit, and that will eventually allow you to have 16-bit linear RAW going out of it, and that will give some options, obviously long-term, for external recording, though that seems to be very limited at the time, at this time. And it's also kind of weird because it's like a neon Atomos monitor that's going to be a giant monitor that will be able to take this signal. So hopefully that will sort itself out in the long term. Let's see what else. I think that's it. I think you have to think about this for form factor being similar to FS7, FS7 Mark II, and it's you know, got same media, 4K internal, same essentially formats inside of the camera system. We're adding AF. We retain the, you know, the electronic ND, which is 1 to 7 stops of ND in the camera system. And it's going to be a workhorse. I mean, there's no question. But when you look at it, it's $11,000. You add the extension unit, which I believe is going to be $2,500, right? So you're looking at $13,500. Now we're not looking at something that's a lot different than the Canon camera. And, you know, that is an interesting conversation. I think that very realistically, the Sony camera is actually in that $10,000 to $20,000 price range. And they want to retain the FS7 Mark II and also have just dropped the FS7, at least here in the States, by $1,500. So I think it's under $6,000 US for the original FS7. So lots of, you know, things going on. So now we move on to the C500 Mark II. And I think we are talking about a camera that is very different than what we've seen from Canon in this price point, especially given Canon's history of how they deal with and what they do with camera systems. So what's interesting about the C500 Mark II, and I am not the first one to say this, is, and we said it on Camera and Flask last week, they are cannibalizing the C700 full frame camera for sure. They're taking their R&D and all of the things that they put into that. My guess is that camera wasn't selling, you know, as well as they had hoped. And they are releasing a camera system here, which is taking, in many ways, all the best bits of the C300 Mark II, the C200, and the C700, and they're creating this combination camera, which I am actually very, very excited about. It's telling when you have people that you know who own much higher end digital cinema cameras, like Alexa Minis and Red cameras, who are saying, I'm thinking about buying a C500 Mark II. It's interesting because one of the things, you know, that we have to say about this camera is, aside from, I would say, raw recording flexibility, meaning ProRes RAW or Blackmagic RAW, and there's a lot of things having to do with patents and things like that that relate to that as well. This camera, in many ways, has it all. It can't. It's no perfect camera system. There's things that people are going to be bothered about related to this camera. but we are taking the workhorse component of the C500 Mark II, which clearly out of the box 4+ years later is one of the most capable cameras. We're adding higher frame rates, which was an Achilles heel to Canon Cinema EOS line, and has been compared to Sony's FS series at least, and building upon that by creating a full frame camera that's recording internally to both those really workhorse codecs, which are very friendly with NLEs, and then adding to that Cinema Raw Light, which was first introduced in the C200. So really kind of a lot of stuff going on here. New processor, fine. It can process things faster. It can allow the things that the camera is doing. Let's switch over to the second page here. Let me move this if I can, and just kind of clean this up a little bit. Okay, so I think that this is a big one, which is, let me just send that to live so you can see the updated version of that. So I think this is a big one. Interchangeable lens mounts, again, really a first for Canon at least. The ability to go from a standardized out-of-the-box EF mount. Hopefully they'll also make the camera available with PL mount as a you're buying the camera option, because I think there's a lot of people out there who are looking at this camera to be used with PL mount. Of course, when you go to PL mount, the one thing that you have to remember is that you're losing the AF capabilities of the camera, because that's really designed for and to be used with their EF mount. And then they also have the option for a lockable or a locking EF mount, which was originally introduced with the Canon Cinema EOS C500, the original Mark I. And they have made it available on the C500 Mark II as a send-in and upgrade. It's expensive. I really was hoping that out of the box we were going to get a locking EF mount for this particular camera, because I think that it makes sense for the type of camera that it is. We're going to, at minimum, throw a 70-200 f2.8 lens on here, and that's just too much to put onto that standard EF mount. You don't want that to bend at all. That comes out of collimation, and then you start to have focus issues within certain parts of your frame. And so I think that, you know, to me that was a little bit of a misstep to not make that the standard mount, especially now that we're looking at the FS7 Mark II, the FX9, and we need to acknowledge that that has a locking E mount, which is more robust and can take heavier lenses without having to put a rod support system along with a lens support underneath the lens there. So dual pixel CMOS AF, supposedly even more improved in this camera system than the previous versions of their Cinema EOS cameras. And I think that overall, we're talking about a beast of a camera system. Let's see what else we've got here. It looks like I still have audio, focus control, shutter settings, electronic image stabilization. That's really the only one that we should talk about here, which is that they have, and remember, this is not a 4x3 sensor. So this is very different than doing open gate on, let's say, an ARRI camera system or Sony Venice and things like that. I believe you do 4.3 on the Sony Venice as well. So it's maybe what you wouldn't call absolute perfect match for anamorphic, but this will do anamorphic with that 17:9 sensor, and it is it's a 5-axis stabilization, and it will include support for basically any lens that's on the market, which I think is incredible. So I think we've got something that's pretty exciting overall when it comes to that. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. So nobody really knows whether or not this stabilization is going to work well or not. And we need to get a hold of the camera in order to really see how well it performs, not only with native Canon lenses, but also with third-party lenses, because it opens up a lot of capabilities, especially because this camera is recording 5.9K natively internally. So that gives a lot of wiggle room when it comes to that. And if I can take some of my old vintage lenses and some other things, and I can hold this camera system and get stabilization, that's I think a pretty big deal. Things are pretty quiet in the chat. Where are you guys? What's going on? Any thoughts on this? I would like to get some feedback. So come on over and join in. Number 4. Expansion modules. So similarly, but different to the FX9 from Sony, you're going to be able to add these expansion units. And one thing that I should mention, which I didn't mention earlier on, is that the C500 Mark II is, I believe, the first shipping Cinema EOS camera that does not come standardly with an electronic viewfinder. So they have upgraded and done a larger touchscreen that is part of the default thing. And thanks, Josh. That you know, this EVF can be added for not a tremendous amount of money. I think it's $600 or $700, so they're not going crazy on that. But I guess it's one way that they decided that they're going to hit that $15,999 price point. And then you have these other 2 expansion units. Number 2 is the big one because, again, this is kind of a first in this sub $20,000 range for them, where you can add something and then you can put a V-mount lock battery onto your camera system, additional XLR inputs and all that kind of stuff. I think if you're buying this camera and you're using it day in and day out, and you're shoulder mounting it, then expansion unit 2 will become a must. Also, if you're purchasing and then you're putting this into a rental house as a sub rental, then you're going to want to make sure that you have probably the EVF option in there, so you can go gimbal, non-gimbal, you know, different types of shooter type scenarios. A lot of people who shoot dock will like to use that EVF when they're outside and just kind of, you know, cradle the camera system and look down into it. And then, you know, beyond that, I think that we have to talk about the fact it comes with a CF Express card, I think a 512. That is a new card. So if you've invested in CFast 2.0 cards, then you are going into that. It's using the same battery system, though, as the C300 Mark II, C200 camera systems. I believe, Josh, that the expansion unit does have knobs, and that is one way that you can get those controls on the left side, but I really don't know. Oh, and then Harrison's talking about the crops. So yes, you can basically reduce, and you can do a full frame Super 35 or a 16 mil Super 16 crop, and that's how you're going to gain frame rates above 60 frames per second. But I guess we'll have to see what's going to happen there. And I like Josh's comment that he's absorbing. So I think that we have some crazy stuff going in there. Yeah, I agree it's okay that it's not an open gate sensor for anamorphic work. I just think that that match when you're using anamorphic, to my knowledge, works really well with a 4.3 sensor. But it's really exciting. So just as sort of an aside, this new Sirui anamorphic 50 mil lens that they're going to make available for, I believe, X-mount, E-mount, and MFT. And that little lens looks like could be pretty interesting. And I'd love to get that on an X-T3. So I've sent out an email to Fujifilm about that, because I don't really do anamorphic. But that lens at around $700 US, if optically is good, could be an interesting start to seeing more anamorphics that are even less expensive, native anamorphics that are not adapters and things like that. So what else do we have here? Log and LUT support. So I think one other thing to talk about is the fact that I don't know about the C700, but again, in sort of the we buy Cinema EOS cameras, this is the first camera that I would consider purchasing from Canon that allows you to load LUTs into the camera. Now, I will say this, when it comes to the C300 Mark II, the LUT support internally in the camera is exceptional in my opinion. I actually am also partial to that menu system on the C300 Mark II, and I've seen some screenshots, and it looks like Canon is now going forward with the menu design of the C200, which I'm not a huge fan of. But as long as all of the options that I have that were in the C300 and are in the C300 Mark II are in there in terms of being able to choose my gamut, my gamma curve, you know, and the other things that you can go inside of the camera and change, then I'll be happy with that camera. Victor, I know I watched your video about the Sirui 50mm, and I liked it. It was funny, and also there was some nice footage in there. So I'm glad that you got to shoot with the camera a little bit. And I'm wondering what camera system you shot that with. Are you an XT user? Are you an E-mount? I think you're a Sony guy when it comes to shooting that stuff. Great times, Trevor, for filmmakers. We are just, it's just crazy. Look, we've got Zcam, Blackmagic, Sony, and Canon. I mean, look, it's just so good in that range. You're right, Trevor. When we look at that $2,000 to $20,000 range, we have so many options. I mean, look at this S1H that has just been, you know, announced and is, you know, coming out and, well, is out from Panasonic. This is just crazy times in terms of what you can do, and it gives us just more tools for us to create more things. Audio, 2 XLR inputs, total of 4 audio tracks for recording, 2 additional ones coming in from the expansion unit 2. I think one thing that we might be obviously losing is that in previous cinema EOS cameras like the C300 Mark II, you had a video input and you had an audio input. They're starting to put XLR inputs on the body of the camera, so the MA400, which is a 2-input XLR box, isn't going to be compatible with this. And then, of course, you have the ability to do to the SD card a proxy recording, which I think is important. I think that's all of our pages here. Let's get back to my ugly mug and keep this conversation going for a few more minutes. So I shot the footage on their own GH5 camera, and my interviews I shot with GH5 Zacuto rig and EZ rig. Thank you, Victor. Do I know if C-Log 2 has the same noise issues Joy, joy, joy. Here we are. So I guess it is. It's the fly. You know, the fly is okay. The fly is meaning it's not okay. It's done. I found the fly. The fly has been exercised from this space. It's not so scary here, everybody. So we're going to stick with, unfortunately, the webcam to wrap this thing up. And I know that everybody's probably gone, but that's life. So at least I'll do a sign off here. And yes, we have an episode tonight at 6 p.m. It will be Eastern time. It will be myself and Caleb because Ben is in Kenya on a project on safari. He looks like he's glamping, and that's the way it is. So there you go. So in terms of these cameras, let's just do a quick little wrap here. Outside of sensor size, where does this fit into the larger EOS ecosystem, C200, blah, 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 blah? What's the bigger picture for purchasing? So the bigger picture for purchasing is that when you're looking for a camera system, the first thing you have to do is you have to think about very much so what type of content you are going to be creating on an ongoing basis. And it used to be pretty simple for me. If I had the you know, the type of company that was going out and shooting music videos, I was doing corporate work, I was doing, you know, some commercial stuff on a lower scale, then I would very oftentimes recommend that people look at the FS7 or FS7 Mark II. If they were looking to do day in, day out corporate work and also documentary work, then the C300 Mark II was the camera that I would recommend. At the moment, that line is a lot blurrier because a lot of what we were missing in the C300 Mark II is coming into the C500 Mark II. Still not sold on the naming of the camera, but so be it. And the same is true very much so, especially with the autofocus capabilities of the FX9, which was sort of its Achilles heel for certain types of work. So, Loom, I'm going to answer that question in a second. So between the two cameras, I'm actually most excited about the C500 Mark II. I think that if I were making a long-term investment in the camera system, that would probably be the one that I would be thinking about getting. And that doesn't really just come into play because I've been using Cinema EOS so much. As I said at the top of the show, I have shot with both the FS7 series and Cinema EOS cameras for a long, long time and on lots of different projects. So I'm not coming at this from a spec standpoint. I'm looking at it as an investment in the camera system. Now, historically, Canon's cameras have dropped in price over time. If that price drop that happens, and it won't happen anytime soon, of $12,999 to the C500 Mark II happens, then it's an even more compelling camera. But I have to say that for $16,000 US, there really isn't a camera like the C500 Mark II at the moment. You could argue that there is, but as a full-frame camera system, there really isn't. I don't know if the same noise issues exist in the lower two stops for the C500 Mark II or the C700 cameras, and that is something that I'll be interested to see in the future. David, I don't know what's going on with the mannequin again, but you're killing me here. So listen, I think those are my basic thoughts on the C500 Mark II and the FX9. I would say that that's my reminder for a client call in a few minutes. But I would say that first and foremost, thank you for sticking with me with all of these issues. I feel like with this new setup and with Lightstream and with, kind of the issues that I'm dealing with right now, that I'm starting all over again when it comes to figuring out my solution for live streaming. I do promise that it will get better over time. The promise for what we can do with this setup, with Lightstream, hopefully, if it continues and it holds up, or it might have to be OBS or something like that. And as we evolve, I think that this whole live streaming, live education thing will get better. It may not add subscribers to the channel, which would kind of suck because I want to be able to justify continuing to do this type of content. But I think that what I'm going to be able to do long term with multiple cameras and switchers and things like that is exciting. And so also up there, is the C200 noise issue due to the heat in the camera? I don't know what you're referring to. I mean, the C200 is a very different camera when you're recording to SD cards or to the CFast cards on the camera system. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they've kind of dumbed down the camera when you're recording to SD cards. You're at a UHD 4K 150 megabits per second. You are recording in 8-bit 422, albeit Canon's Magic Secret Sauce 8-bit. And overall, the noise is manageable. And I use Canon Log 3 a lot, but that's in a Rec 709 gamut, so it's more reduced. When you're shooting in Cinema Raw Light and you bring that footage into any of the NLEs that you use the plugin for, what happens is it will by default convert it to Canon Log 2 and to Cinema Gamut as your gamut. And then what you can do is you can change that, especially if you're using Canon software. But you can basically say, no, I really want to be working in Canon Log 3 and 709 or a P3 or a 2020 gamut. I'm interested in Zcam, by the way, a lot more than Kinfinity. I think that as a company, they have a more of a face. I think that they're listening to users, and I can't wait to get my hands on one of those cameras when they ship. I'd like to thank everybody for coming to the stream. The numbers are getting better. The conversations are getting more interesting. And if you can deal with, for just a little while longer, my ridiculous technical issues that I'm having, then I really appreciate everybody and coming to the live streams here for Gearbox. I will continue to do some recorded ones. In fact, I think next week I've got one, and possibly the next week after that. But we do have a live stream every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, and that is Cameron Flask. And I will be joined today by just Caleb, but next week Ben will be back as well. Come check it out. Come join the Three Amigos. Link is at the top of the chat right at the beginning for this one. And thank you very much, everybody. And thanks for sticking with me. And I'll talk to you.